Hi everyone, this is Dan Clanton, and this is our mini lecture over England and Europe in the 17th century. The Elizabethan age in England, which was a time of recognition and prosperity for Protestantism, came to an end with the death of Elizabeth in 1603. Her cousin James I, King of Scotland, took the throne and became the first of the Stuart monarchs. A staunch supporter of absolutist monarchies, James soon became adversarial in his dealings with Parliament. Much of the opposition to James's rule was religious, as many English Protestants felt the Reformation was moving too slowly in Britain. These various groups were referred to as Puritans, so called because of their wish to purify the Church of England from what they held to be useless and artificial human additions. As the church historian Justo Gonzalez writes, Puritans, quote, opposed many of the traditional elements of worship that the church had retained, such as the use of the cross, certain priestly garments, and the celebration of communion on an altar. They also insisted on the need for a sober life, guided by the commandments of Scripture, and lacking in luxury and ostentation. Since a great deal of the worship of the Church of England appeared to them as needlessly elaborate, this caused further objection to that worship. Many insisted on the need to keep the Lord's Day, devoting it exclusively to religious exercises and to the practice of charity. They were not absolutely opposed to the use of alcohol, for most of them drank moderately, but they were very critical of drunkenness, particularly among the ministers of the Church of England. They were also very critical of all they considered to be licentious, and this included the theater. They were also opposed to bishops, since little biblical evidence could be found for the way in which the church hierarchy had been formed. Many also believed that baptism could only be administered to understanding adults, not infants, and this belief earned some of them the name Baptists. Opposition to James wasn't only religious, though. In 1605, the famed gunpowder plot was discovered, in which several conspirators, including Guy Fawkes, planned to blow up the Houses of Parliament on November 5, 1605. The 5th of November, ironically, has now become a holiday in England. When James died in 1625 and his son Charles I took over, this tension reached new heights. Holding, as his father did, that kingly rule is a divine right, Charles did his best to rule effectively without the aid of Parliament. In fact, he managed to rule for more than a decade, beginning in 1629, without ever calling a session of Parliament. 4 years later, in 1633, William Laud was made Archbishop of Canterbury. He was a devout Anglican and resolved to persecute the Puritans until they capitulated. Charles soon gave Laud free rein in Scotland, and he sought to enforce the Anglican liturgy through military might. The Scots rebelled, and Charles finally called a session of Parliament in 1640 because he wanted to raise taxes to help fight the Scottish rebels. Parliament, though, refused to help Charles unless he agreed to reform the church. Thus began what historians call the Long Parliament, lasting from 1640 to 1660. First, Parliament took steps to address and rectify the persecution of Puritans by the monarchy. Then, in 1641, they passed a law that stated that Parliament could not be dissolved unless the body itself agreed to it. Now, by this time, it was becoming more and more obvious that armed conflict was on the way, and both Charles and Parliament began amassing troops. Civil war broke out, lasting from 1642 to 1648. During the war, Parliament convened the famous collection of theologians known as the Westminster Assembly, which in its seminal Confession of 1647 laid the groundwork for both Calvinist orthodoxy and British Presbyterianism. Charles was finally captured with the help of a virtually unknown member of Parliament named Oliver Cromwell, and was beheaded on January 30th, 1649. Through a rather daring occupation of the Parliament building, Cromwell took over the government, established the Commonwealth, and accepted the title of Lord Protector. His goal was to work with a parliament with representatives from England, Scotland, and Ireland, but in reality Cromwell himself was the government. His program of reformation was decidedly Puritan, but it didn't survive him. When he died in 1658, his son Richard resigned his inherited position, and Charles II, already ruling in Scotland, was invited to take the English throne. A Catholic, Charles II was religiously tolerant in theory, but the violence with which rebellions were met in Scotland belied this stance. After he died, his brother James II took over, and he was an even more conservative Catholic. He lasted on 3 years before a rebellion broke out in England, and William of Orange and his wife Mary, James's daughter, were invited to take the throne. Their reign, beginning in 1688, ushered in a new period of tolerance for religious and political dissidents. One of the most important contributions James I made to the culture of his time was what we usually call the King James Version of the Bible, or what in Britain is known as the Authorized Version. Very soon after the death of Elizabeth, James convened the Hampton Court Conference in January 1604 to determine what, if anything, needed to be addressed in the church. Not much was noted, except the following resolution, quote, that a translation be made of the whole Bible, as consonant as can be to the original Hebrew and Greek, and this to be set out and printed without any marginal notes, and only to be used in all churches of England in times of divine service. Now, it may seem odd to us that so much emphasis would be put on marginal notes, but James was famously annoyed by the marginal notes found in the Geneva Bible of 1560, which were unabashedly Calvinistic in their theological slant, and as such supported a very Puritan way of reading the Bible. In avoiding marginal notes, as well as specifying the locale for the reading of this new translation, James was making sure that the Church of England would have its own text. There's some confusion over exactly how many translators were involved in this project, but no one disputes that when this authorized edition was published in 1611, it exerted an enormous influence on the way the Bible was read, as well as the English language itself. In his work, Gerald Hammond writes that, quote, everyone concedes that the Authorized Version is itself a great work of art. It marked the culmination of nearly 100 years of English Bible translation. One of the most important religious innovations during this period was the development of Pietism. Its founder, Philip Jakob Spener, had studied Protestant theology, but had grown unhappy with the standard, increasingly hierarchical worship services current during the 17th century. He began to establish fellowships of piety, that is, small conclaves of egalitarian lay worshippers. His followers termed these the little church, to be contrasted with the big church. In 1675, Spener published his Pia Desideria, that is, pious desires, which became the charter for this movement. Some of the emphases of this text include an emphasis on scripture, not dogma, lay involvement, more practical training for ministers, that is, less Aristotle and more actual pragmatic counseling training, a better balance between intellectual pursuits and spirituality, and an end to controversies, wars, and doctrinal skirmishes over religion. Now, Pietists in general understand Christianity as a personal relationship with God. They emphasized a concern for social justice and were very involved with missionary activities. One of the most influential Pietist movements was led by John Wesley, an itinerant preacher who, along with his brother Charles, founded the Methodist movement in England. Among Wesley's many theological contributions, one of the most interesting is what's come to be known as the Wesleyan quadrilateral. As you can see here on the slide, there are 4 sides to this quadrilateral. The first, Bible or Scripture. This represents the Protestant inheritance of Methodism. Second, tradition, which represents an influence of Catholicism. Third, reason, which details the influence that both deism and the Enlightenment had on the Wesleys. And finally, experience, which also played into the emphasis on mysticism in most early pietist movements. I should let you know that currently, Methodism claims almost 13 million members worldwide and almost 43,000 congregations. One of the most influential events to occur in Europe after the end of the 16th century was the 30 Years' War and the subsequent Peace of Westphalia. This war resulted from the inadequacy of the 1555 Peace of Augsburg to regulate religious tolerance as well as religious unrest between Catholics and Protestants in Bohemia. Now, since this is a mini lecture focused on the development of Christianity, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about what goes on during the 30 Years' War. Suffice it to say, the war was extremely bloody and destructive, and it was only with the help of the young Swedish king, Gustavus Adolphus, that the Protestants were able to push the Catholics into negotiations. In 1648, the Peace of Westphalia was signed, with France and Sweden receiving the lion's share of land, and all peoples involved in the treaty, royalty as well as subjects, would be free to choose their own religion as long as it was Catholic, Protestant, or Reformed. The historical impact of the war, though, goes beyond these considerations. Again, drawing on the work of church historian Justo Gonzalez, he writes, quote, "The principles of tolerance of the Peace of Westphalia were not born out of a deeper understanding of Christian love, but rather out of a growing indifference to religious matters. The war had amply shown the atrocities that resulted from attempting to settle religious matters by force of arms. In the end, nothing had been resolved. Perhaps rulers should not allow their decisions to be guided by religious or confessional considerations, but rather by their own self-interest or by the interest of their subjects. Thus, the modern secular state began to develop." Now Gonzalez continues, "And with it, there appeared a multitude of doubt regarding matters that previous generations had taken for granted. On what grounds did theologians dare to affirm they were correct and that others were mistaken? Could any doctrine be true that produced the atrocities of the 30 Years' War? Was there not a more tolerant, more profound, and even more Christian way to serve God than simply following the dictates of orthodoxy, be it Catholic or Protestant?" Thus the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia led to the development of nation-states, as well as sowed the seeds for the major intellectual movements one finds in the later 17th and 18th centuries, such as orthodoxy, rationalism, and empiricism, all of which ultimately leads to what historians refer to as the modern age. This has been our mini lecture over England and Europe in the 17th century. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to your feedback.